Despite millions of Americans watching the events of January 6th unfold on their TV screens, there have been several conspiracy theories and attempts to rewrite the story of that day a year later. Politicians, pundits, and voices across social media continue to spread multiple unfounded theories that have emerged since the attack, including one that the federal government facilitated the riot. The falsehoods may signal just how many Americans may no longer trust the country's institutions. So joining me now to talk a little bit more about this is the co-founder and CEO and editor of The Dispatch, Stephen Hayes. Stephen, thanks for joining us. The Dispatch, I think I can describe as sort of a center-right publication. You are a bona fide conservative. And I want people to know, the position that you're coming from here. Police officers have testified, and criminal proceedings have, been opened in court. Conspiracy theories, however, continue to surround the January 6th attack. Why do you think Americans continue to cling to these unproven theories?
Yeah, it's a great question. Really one of the central questions of our time. I think if you look at the way that our information system works, the way that disinformation flows, people are basically living in silos. We're not talking, we're not sharing information, we're not sharing the same facts. And you have information silos that basically allow people to live in their own reality. And I think to a certain extent, to a great extent, that explains the political polarization that we're seeing today. You have many Republicans who get their information from talk radio, from Fox News, and aren't necessarily exposed to the reporting or are skeptical of the reporting that they see elsewhere. They believe it when someone like Tucker Carlson suggests to them that the FBI was behind or might have had a role in fomenting the January 6th attacks. And they don't believe it when I would say mountains of evidence are presented in courtrooms after the after the January 6th attacks, showing that Trump supporters were in fact the perpetrators of the attacks. And I think that's a real problem for our democracy.
It's one thing if you watch this unfold on TV and you're getting a lot of your information from social media, but there were people who were there. The lawmakers, they were there. And right after the attack, Democratic and Republican lawmakers, like Nancy Pelosi, Kevin McCarthy, they seem to be on the same page about holding these people accountable. But over time now, a divide has emerged. These lawmakers know better. They were there. Their lives were on the line. We know that Kevin McCarthy was on the phone, begging for something to be done. Why do you suppose we've seen this division 1 year later?
Yeah, so I don't want to both sides this. I don't want to pretend that both sides are equally at fault here. The Republicans stood behind a president who fomented an attack on the U.S. Capitol and have stood by him ever since. I will say in those early days, Nancy Pelosi made a series of errors that I think ended up proving costly. She politicized the reaction to what happened. She politicized the impeachment proceedings, refusing or failing to include Republicans in what Democrats were trying to do. In those days right after the attack, there were Republican lawmakers, Republicans in Congress, who were willing to work with Democrats to impeach the president and convict the president. You'll remember there was a moment where Mitch McConnell had given indications that he was willing to vote for conviction. It looked like there might be a couple dozen Republicans, maybe more, who were willing to vote for impeachment in the House of Representatives. But Nancy Pelosi chose to take a partisan path. And I think we're seeing the effects of that to a certain extent. She did the same thing with the January 6th commission, where she sent out a letter without even consulting the Republicans who had already indicated a willingness to participate in this. I'm not talking about Republicans like Jim Jordan, who may have had a role in January 6th. I'm talking about people like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Peter Meyer, Anthony Gonzalez, and others who had, expressed concern about what happened there, had voted for impeaching the president, and I think were willing to see a serious January 6th commission happen. Now, having said all that, this is not a Nancy Pelosi problem. This is a Republican Party problem. And the great irony, I think, if you look back 1 year ago today, is that Republicans on that day and in the days that followed harshly criticized Donald Trump. I think appropriately placed blame on the president for his role in inciting the violence. What we've learned in the years since is that violence was part of a much broader attempt by the president and his top advisors to keep him in power. That's what this was about. You had memos from John Eastman suggesting that Vice President Mike Pence could unilaterally send these results back to the states, could sort of invalidate the results of the election. You had the president's lawyers that night making phone calls, on the night of January 6th, making phone calls, begging senators to delay the certification so that the president could continue to fight. And we now know there was a war room next door at the Willard Hotel next to the White House for planning on January 6th. So this wasn't some spontaneous uprising or a protest gone bad. This was a plan. And the plan was to keep the president of the United States in power. What makes this so remarkable is that Republicans who condemned the president that day for his role and in the days that followed have largely re-embraced him in the years since, despite the fact that we now know he tried to overturn a legitimate election to stay in power. That's what's extraordinary about this moment.
Mm-hmm. Your publication, The Dispatch, recently sat down with Republican Representative Liz Cheney, to talk about the work that she and the rest of the House committee investigating the January 6th attack are doing. I am curious about what she would deem a success when it comes to the work that this panel is doing, because it has occurred to me, and basically what we're talking about is how divided this country continues to be, and how, there are different realities that people are living in this country. So I'm wondering what the goal or various goals of the panel is, aside from obviously investigating what happened, and what would a success be for Liz Cheney?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we put that question to her. And I think for her, the primary goal here is to elucidate the truth, to find out what happened and make it clear for as many people as possible. Now, I think that the committee has been sort of tainted by the perception of partisanship, again, in part because of Nancy Pelosi's actions early. Certainly, Kevin McCarthy has obstructed the work of the committee, has attacked the committee at every turn, has tried to invalidate it, I think because some of his members may be implicated in what happened on January 6th. But I think, her goal, in a sense, is to try to find out what happened. And they have had tremendous success. And I think this has been an undercovered story, having interviewed more than 300 witnesses. They've gotten cooperation from top people who were in meetings at the White House that day. This hasn't gotten a lot of fanfare, but they've done interviews with senior officials who worked for Mike Pence that day. They've gotten cooperation from other senior White House officials who opposed what the president did that day. They have eyewitness testimony that the president himself sat and watched television for several hours, sort of enthusiastic about the violence that he was seeing unfold at the Capitol. And I think that is sort of the real one of the things that the committee could do is by gathering contemporaneous documents, by doing these eyewitness interviews, by inviting people to tell their stories, they can put together a record that is sort of immune to partisan recasting or mischaracterizing. Now, that will happen, of course. I mean, the people who don't want the truth to come out will do everything they can to fight it. But if you have these documents, the texts that were exchanged as the violence was unfolding, the contemporaneous accounts of people who were in these rooms, I think that will go a long way to establish what happened and why it's important, why we should continue to be concerned about the direction of a country when something like this can happen.
Is she concerned, though, despite all that work, despite more than 300 interviews, and we make an awful lot out of the individuals that are not cooperating. A lot of people are cooperating, as you point out.
Correct.
Is she concerned, though, that despite all of that, some people, a significant portion of the population, will never believe the outcome of the House committee's investigation?
Yeah, I think she is concerned. I mean, I've talked to her about this. I think she is concerned about that. And again, this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, where you have people living in these information silos. They get their information from one or two sources, or increasingly from social media and people who may or may not even be interested in telling the truth. And they can sort of wall themselves off from reality. And I think in some ways, that's what you're seeing happen here. I mean, the numbers, the CBS polling on what happened on January 6th, I think is illustrative in this case. You have people who basically think it was more or less peaceful. It wasn't really a big deal. people who think the president wasn't involved, majority of Republicans who still think the election was stolen in one way or the other. These are things that conflict with reality, and there's I think a continued concern that you're just not going to penetrate some of those information silos. But I think the more prevalent the actual truth becomes, the more you can point to somebody who was sitting next to Donald Trump in one of these meetings and can say, or in the Oval Office that day, and say, look, I watched the president of the United States. As this was happening, the president did nothing, or the president was laughing, or the president was encouraged by what he saw. That will matter, I do think, in the long run.
And very quickly, I got to ask you this. Do you think that this event and everything leading up to it has permanently changed the landscape of politics in this country? Do you see, will we ever get back to the kind of conversations that we used to have, 20 years ago that were less divisive?
I think it has. I'm sad to say. I think it really has. Look, we're talking about the peaceful transfer of power. It's one of the things that makes our American experiment, our republic, unique. The fact that we've been doing this for more than 2 centuries and doing it successfully, the voluntary relinquishing of power is, it's seen as routine in democracies around the world today. Certainly it's because the United States has been doing it for so long, but that was called into question. I mean, that's what happened here. And I think it's important that people grapple with that fact, Republicans in particular. The president of the United States incited violence, incited attacks for the purposes of aiding a broader conspiracy for him to remain in power despite the fact that he lost the election. That doesn't happen in the United States. And the fact that the Republican Party has re-embraced President Trump, knowing all of that, I think suggests that we have some difficult times ahead as we work through this.
Stephen Hayes, thanks for spending time with us this morning. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks for having me.